Hi, everybody. I'm Yuan Chen, Assistant Professor of Chinese at Nanyang Technological University. And today, it's my honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Paul Goldin. Professor Goldin is Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in early Chinese intellectual and cultural history. Professor Goldin established himself as a young scholar at a young age, as he received his PhD from Harvard at the age of 24. He wrote his dissertation on the Xunzi under the guidance of Professor Du Weiming. Upon graduating from Harvard, Professor Goldin got his first and current job at the University of Pennsylvania. He has written many books. Among them are Rituals of the Way, The Philosophy of Xunzi, The Culture of Sex in Ancient China, After Confucius, Studies in Early Chinese Philosophy, and more recently, The Art of Chinese Philosophy, A Classical Text and How to Read Them. Today, he will give a lecture titled A Chinese Reading of Epictetus. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Goldin.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak in this wonderful series. Let me start with a couple of preliminaries. First of all, I got my second vaccination yesterday, and I'm a little woozy. So if I should say anything foolish over the next hour or two, blame that on the vaccine. Don't blame that on me. Second, a little bit of explanation as to how I got interested in Stoicism. Last March, when it became clear that the pandemic was real and life would change, I decided I should probably read Epictetus. I knew about Epictetus, but hadn't read very extensively since graduate school. And I was floored, first of all, by how powerful the philosophy was. Of course, March of 2020 was a nice receptive time to be reading Epictetus. It's the right philosophy for the time. And then secondly, I was also amazed by the parallels that I was finding with Chinese philosophy, and not any single Chinese thinker or school of philosophy either. It seemed to be pretty pervasive. And so I spent the next several months thinking about why that might be. And the result was the paper that I'm about to read. Now, as I said, I will read. When I have a paper written, I don't pretend that I haven't. So I will be reading, but I have a PowerPoint. Let me share that. And you should be able to follow along easily on the screen. I won't usually read out all of the translations, because that will take quite a bit of time. But they'll be up on the screen, so you should be able to follow along quite easily just by seeing what's on the screen. So let me start the slideshow. Everybody can see that, I assume. All right. Yes, then let's begin. So we'll start with an introduction to the problem. After decades of attempts, comparisons between classical Chinese and Greco-Roman philosophy have had limited success. While there have been some productive lines of inquiry, for example, comparing early Confucian ethics to virtue ethics as represented by Aristotle, the overall record is disappointing because concepts such as Plato's theory of forms or Aristotle's emphasis on syllogism have proved incommensurable with most classical Chinese ways of thinking. But much of the problem can be attributed to the habit of comparing Chinese thinkers to Plato and Aristotle without asking whether they are the most suitable philosophers for this purpose. For most of the 20th century, Hellenistic philosophy was scarcely considered. Yet very recently, provocative similarities have been identified between Chinese philosophy and Stoicism, especially Epictetus. I shall argue below that these parallels are even more significant than previous scholarship has recognized. I hope to convince the reader, or in this case the audience, that some of them are indeed staggering, and conclude by asking why we find such parallels in the first place. My claim will not be direct or even indirect transmission. This is a case, to borrow a distinction from evolutionary biology of analogous rather than homologous development. To my knowledge, the first explicit comparison of Epictetus to Chinese philosophy was made by Qian Zhongshu in his magnum opus Guanzhi Bian, first published in 1979-80, where he cited Discourses 118 and Enchiridion 16 in connection with Chinese ideas about maintaining imperturbability in the face of raging emotions. This was not only remarkably late in view of the manifold and profound parallels to be examined below, but also failed to attract immediate attention, inasmuch as fuller comparisons were not undertaken until the present century. But much progress has been made in the last 20 years. And the next section will somewhat briefly review parallels observed by other scholars. This section will be crisp because there's no need to rehearse details that have already been published elsewhere, though I shall add my own observations where appropriate. In many cases, there are other passages that amplify or complicate the theme. The first parallel has been aptly articulated by Earl J. Coleman. Quote, Stoics and Taoists alike affirm that there is a commanding unity in the universe, a connectedness of all ever-developing things. In short, nature is a living continuum, unquote. In Chinese philosophy, this commanding unity is usually called Dao, the way. Some texts, such as Zhuangzi, occasionally use Tian, heaven, or even Di, the deity, virtually interchangeably with Dao, but others, such as Lao Tzu and Xunzi, keep these terms strictly distinct. In Greek philosophy, equivalent keywords include theos, logos, nomos, and so on. A. Long, to my mind, the most distinguished scholar of Hellenistic philosophy, describes the concept simply as, quote, the way things are, unquote. That is, quote, both the microscopic and macroscopic structure of the world and the foundation of all values, unquote. A description that could apply equally to the Tao. This parallel is not limited to Stoicism, for one finds logos in senses reminiscent of Tao in other Greek thinkers as well. The operative metaphor, of course, is different. Tao is the right path and did not even have any cosmological dimension in archaic contexts. It is closer to Greek hodos than logos. The habit of looking to nature for foundational patterns and metaphors is well attested in both Epictetus and Chinese philosophy. For example, when Epictetus claims that friends influence one another like neighboring coals, if I don't cite a reference and you're curious to know, just bring it up in the Q&A, and because I won't yell out all the references while I'm speaking. This is not truly an argument, right? Friends influence one another like neighboring coals, unless it rests on the deeper assumption that certain general patterns in nature underlie observable phenomena as ostensibly disparate as the mutual influence of friends and pieces of coal. Arguing from alleged patterns in nature is so typical of Chinese philosophy and amply treated in current scholarship that no more needs to be said here. David Machek, I don't know how to pronounce his name. One day I'd like to meet him. I think it's Machek, has pointed out that the concept of a providential universe leads in both Stoicism and Taoism to amor fati. And here's the quote. Machek illustrates the Stoic submission to fate with references to Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, and goes on to cite parallels with Zhuangzi. Yet there are several other passages in both Epictetus and Zhuangzi that are even more striking. So here are the two from Epictetus that I have in mind. Keep Cleanthes is an earlier Stoic. Keep Cleanthes' verse handy. Lead me Zeus, lead me destiny. All translations from Epictetus are taken from the published translation by Dobbin. All translations from Chinese texts are going to be my own. Do I have to go to Rome? Then I go to Rome. To Gyara? All right, I go to Gyara. Compare the following very famous passage from Zhuangzi, where the fictional Ziyu, racked with a disfiguring disease, has just been asked by his friend Zisu whether he resents it. Soon after this is wonderful, right? Suppose my buttocks were transformed. I'd turn into a car. Wonderful. Soon thereafter, a third friend falls ill and echoes Ziyu's view, ridiculing those who wish to remain human forever, as though they were metal that wished to dictate to the smith how it should be fashioned. Epictetus's example of coming to terms with the loss of one's wife and children, an indication that he envisioned only male students, recalls famous passages in Zhuangzi 18:2. The same is true of coming to terms with one's own death, which is unavoidable and in any case not necessarily frightening. Another Stoic response is the theme of knowing contentment, especially the wisdom not to seek it in fortune, fame, or even health, which we cannot control. This has been compared to both the Taoist and Buddhist understanding of suffering as the consequence of unenlightened attachment to material and hence impermanent things. One important difference, perhaps inadequately emphasized, is that Buddhist and Stoic ontology are radically different. For most Buddhists, the phenomenal world is not simply beyond our control, but indeed empty or insubstantial. I do not read Epictetus as saying that fortune is ontically insubstantial. For both Epictetus and Zhuangzi, freedom is possible only when we sunder such bonds. Epictetus's lectures on freedom, eleutheria, become all the more poignant when we bear in mind that he was a former slave. There is no single Chinese word in Zhuangzi that corresponds to Epictetus's freedom, but the text certainly agrees that as long as one's happiness depends on external factors, one is not in command of one's life. Stoics and Zhuangzi thus counsel regulation of emotions and desires, for even though these may arise involuntarily, we still have the power to determine whether and how we will act on them, and folly will be requited by discontent. There is disagreement as to whether each tradition advocates extirpating emotions. Lastly, Coleman makes an important observation, not echoed as far as I know in any other publication. Stoics and Taoists value well-wrought expression. In Epictetus, the idea is most clearly expressed in Discourses 223. While I wholeheartedly agree with Coleman that Zhuangzi, with its delightful parables, dialogues, and poetic language, could not have been written by authors who did not delight in innovative literary expression, the most explicit statements of the power of elegant speech are found in Confucian texts. And this lays the foundation for the next section. While the insights recapitulated above are valid and significant, they barely scratch the surface because previous inquiries have needlessly limited the scope to Zhuangzi. So now we move on to the longest section of the paper, parallels not observed by other scholars. And here we'll have to take some time. For a comparatist, what is most fascinating about Epictetus is that there are counterparts to his ideas in many, if not all, of the predominant classical Chinese philosophical texts. This phenomenon will have to be explained, but first the evidence needs to be presented and analyzed. This section will necessarily be more extensive than the previous one. In the modern world, Epictetus is probably best known for his comments on punishment. Many political prisoners have reported drawing strength from Epictetus's conception of the mind as a citadel, Acropolis in Greek, that mere physical abuse should not be able to subdue. Philosophically speaking, this attitude toward punishment is subsumed under Epictetus's general insistence not to try to control externals, but to focus doggedly on the one thing we can, prohairesis, for which Long proposes the translation volition. Many others opt for simply will. Epictetus was evidently interested in punishment as a particularly instructive example because he returned to it repeatedly, as in some of these examples. These and similar passages, are reminiscent of this pregnant line from more examples. These and similar passages are reminiscent of this pregnant line from Encountering Sorrow, the rhyme prose that opens the collection called Lyrics of Chu. This one I will read because it's so remarkable. Though my body may be dismembered, I would still not change, for how could my mind be reformed through punishment? It was this parallel that first drew my attention to Epictetus, because the reliance in both texts on an underlying mind-body contrast is unlikely to be coincidental and suggests, like a promising trial excavation, yet more data awaiting discovery. Until recently, Chinese intellectual history was still in thrall to the myth that pre-Buddhist Chinese writing was devoid of mind-body problems, and the significance of this parallel might have escaped notice. The nature of the distinction drawn between mind and body, it should be noticed, is not exactly the same. The author of Encountering Sorrow, like most Chinese writers with implicitly dualistic paradigms, understood the heart or heart-mind seen as a fleshy part of the body. It was simply the part of the body where mental processes take place, as a modern dualist would regard the brain. Epictetus, however, does not portray prohairesis as a part of the body. It is a faculty with which we are blessed and which we can develop, but it is not material in any respect. Nevertheless, this unexpected point of convergence can serve as a springboard for deeper comparison. So first, Epictetus and Confucian texts, especially Mencius and Xunzi. Epictetus contrasts mind and body, not for some academic purpose, but to distinguish between the aspects of ourselves that should and should not concern us, and by the same token, the aspects where happiness can and cannot be found. Because human beings have both minds and bodies, we stand between gods and animals. This is almost exactly how the tension between the animal and moral facets of our nature is related in Mencius. Most human beings ignore their higher faculties, which are endowed by heaven, and consequently slide toward bestial conduct. That by which people differ from birds and beasts is slight. Common people abandon it, the nobleman preserves it. What's it? We learn from a nearby sentence that the phrase, that by which people differ from birds and beasts, refers to the heart with its indwelling virtue. This is because our hearts are implanted with the four beginnings. The Siduan, that is, the capacity for the virtues of humanity, righteousness, ritual, and wisdom, which are my translations of Renyi Li Zhi. Whoever does not possess these four capacities in his or her heart is not human. Similarly, we are born with greater parts, dati, and lesser parts, xiaoti, that is, the heart and the other organs, respectively. Most people follow their lesser parts and become corrupted by appetite and desire, but the rare few who follow their greater parts become great people, daren. Just as Epictetus believes that we are responsible for our own happiness or unhappiness and must not blame others, Mencius believes we are responsible for our own morality or immorality and must not blame our surroundings. A sharp reader may observe that Epictetus speaks of happiness and fortune, Mencius morality for its own sake. But the contrast is not as great as it may seem, for both Stoics and Confucians are convinced that happiness is attainable only through reasoned moral action. Even stronger parallels with Epictetus's prohairesis can be found in Xunzi. For every challenge, remember the resources you have within you to cope with it. And one such resource, that's dynamis, is that of thought or intellection, in other words, dianoia. It is stupid to say, tell me what to do. What should I tell you? It would be better to say, make my mind adaptable to any circumstance. Saying, tell me what to do is like an illiterate saying, tell me what to write whenever I'm presented with a name, right? Wouldn't you rather learn how to write instead of just learning how to write your name? Where Epictetus entreats us to bear in mind the general principle, that's the katholikos, and train our minds to adapt to any circumstance. Xunzi also praises those who use their heart minds to apprehend the way, because then they can master any particular skill. What distinguishes the overseer from the farmer, the merchant, and so on, is that the overseer could learn to oversee any conceivable activity. The farmer doesn't know how to do anything except farm. The merchant doesn't know how to do anything except work, apply his trade in the market. Two further, even deeper parallels. One, both Epictetus and Xunzi regard the mind, or prohairesis in the case of Epictetus, as the faculty that commands all the others. And two, both thinkers demand that we use this unique resource to study the timeless patterns of the universe and apply them to our own lives. Here it's quite clear. Dobbin uses the will for prohairesis, and that's fine with me. When philosophers use this kind of specialized vocabulary, the translator has no good options. He or she just has to choose whichever works best, and then the philosophical reader will understand that this is representing an underlying Greek concept. Here compare Xunzi. The mind is the lord of the body, the master of godlike insight, and so on and so forth. The detail, you may or may not have noticed it, that both Epictetus and Xunzi thought immediately of contrasting the mind with the mouth. Epictetus says, right, the faculty of speech. It goes on to dismantle that. And then Xunzi also says, right, the mouth can be forced, right, and so on and so forth. The detail that both Epictetus and Xunzi thought immediately of contrasting the mind with the mouth suggests that they were engaging audiences accustomed to extolling artful speech, a hint at some broad commonalities in their intellectual worlds to be explored further below. Thus, Epictetus and Xunzi also believe that because we have minds, we have the capacity to resist temptation by reflecting on it and choosing a wiser and nobler course. This is one of the most important passages in all of Epictetus. With these thoughts, he's just described Socrates, who was able to resist a sexual temptation. With these thoughts to defend you, you should triumph over any impression and not be dragged away. Hold on a moment. Let me see who you are and what you represent. Let me put you to the test. Every time there's a temptation, you have the capacity to respond with that kind of self-reflection. Xunzi makes a similar point by reminding us that in extreme cases, people can choose to commit suicide out of conviction. Recall Epictetus's reference to death by hanging or jumping off a cliff, even though they love life more than anything else. The only explanation is the power of the rational heart mind. What other reason could there be why people choose to kill themselves? The possibility of suicide brought on by depression, that is, not desiring life, does not seem to concern Xunzi here. Rather, the point is that a heart mind worthy of admiration is capable of overriding the most basic impulse of all, namely self-preservation, if it is incompatible with a moral life. If we permit ourselves to tread an unworthy path, we cannot blame our emotions or desires, but must accept that our heart mind has failed to exert the requisite discipline. A fragment preserved in Stobaeus, it's a fragment of Epictetus, Musonius Rufus, another Stoic allegedly quoting Epictetus, is also highly reminiscent of Xunzi. Though the attribution to Epictetus is open to doubts, the scholars who know more than I do disagree, it's still an authentic Stoic voice, and hence merits consideration here. The nature of the universe was, is, and always will be the same. Any reader of Xunzi is going to notice that comment. For Xunzi too, the idea of the constancy, chang, of the way is fundamental. This is Xunzi's Tianlun. Heaven's processes, tianxing, do not change from one epoch to the next. Although heaven never intercedes directly, human affairs are certain to succeed or fail according to a timeless pattern that heaven determined before human beings existed. To be sure, there are important differences for Epictetus or Musonius Rufus, whoever is responsible for this fragment. The goal of directing one's mind toward the nature of the universe is to attain, quote, an altogether balanced and harmonious life. Panometrios kai musikos bios, in Greek. Whereas Xunzi wishes to build a harmonious government and society on apperceived cosmological foundations. We shall return to this point below. One final similarity between Epictetus and Xunzi: both rank life forms in a hierarchy, with plants at the bottom, animals in the middle, and human beings at the top. We stand at the apex because we have intelligence, which we use to domesticate other species. Here's Epictetus, and then he goes on to present the example of a donkey, which is useful to humans, but is not on their level because it lacks the capacity to reason. Otherwise, it would refuse to obey. When I read this, donkeys are notorious for refusing to obey. So Epictetus must have been familiar with extraordinarily docile donkeys to have chosen that example. But none of these philosophers were zoologists. They were using examples that they thought furthered their philosophical argument. They would have failed a modern biology class. Compare Xunzi with very famous passage, water and fire have qi but no life, and so on and so forth. Once again, Xunzi appeals to government and society and advances his vision of a stratified society with wise gentlemen advising a sage king at the top, where Epictetus has us domesticating donkeys without the need for a body politic. But both locate our primacy among species in our ability to reason, which is also our ability to reason morally. This is not to say that either philosopher was completely accurate in his characterization of animal behavior. As I can see, Xunzi says all sorts of things about animals that are actually not true. With such a strong commitment on each side to training the mind and studying the patterns of nature in order to live in it most productively, it is no surprise that both Stoics and Confucians stress independent judgment and learning for one's own sake rather than to impress others. This is very typical of Epictetus. Why are you so concerned about other people's approbation? You call them maniacs. Do you want to earn the approbation of maniacs? You have to have the self-confidence and fortitude to live your life according to your own judgments and not worry about other people's judgments. Compare the very famous lines from the Confucian Analects, right? I am not vexed that others do not know me. I am vexed that I do not know others. In antiquity, people learn for their own sake. Today, they learn for the sake of others. Weiji Weiren. Thinking and judging for oneself, not merely following the most popular or convenient standard, and carrying on with equanimity in an unappreciative, if not outright contemptuous world, are cornerstones of the Confucian way of life. All this mental training requires regular practice, another basic conviction of both Stoics and Confucians. Discourses 2:18 is probably the fullest expression of this ideal in Epictetus, as in the opening lines. Stop walking and then try to take a walk. If you want to do something well, do it habitually. The same goes for moral inclinations. Compare this passage where Mencius asserts that the accumulated effects of regular moral conduct improve the substance of the heart-mind. Before this, nourishing one's qi was usually understood as a bodily activity, such as calisthenics or meditation. Think of traditions like Neye. For Mencius, by contrast, the secret is to accumulate righteousness day in and day out. Morality is good for your health. One part of this regular practice in both Stoicism and Confucianism is scrupulous self-examination. Here in Epictetus, there are other Stoics who have even more elaborate interrogations that they force upon themselves, surrounded as we are by such people, so confused, so ignorant of what they're saying and of whatever faults they may or may not have, where those faults come from and how to get rid of them. I think we too should make a habit of asking ourselves, could it be that I'm one of them? What illusions about myself do I entertain? Followed by other searching questions, and any reader familiar with Chinese philosophy is immediately going to think of the so-called Sanxing, the triple self-examination attributed to Confucius's disciple Zhengzi. Much simpler, but in the same spirit. It is only to be expected that philosophies that require unflagging commitment to discipline and moral practice produce daily self-examinations of this kind. In the same vein, Epictetus and Confucians look askance at impractical book learning. In the Analects, the Confucian perspective is presented in the very first line. Confucius and all subsequent Confucians have regarded morality as a matter of thinking first, but then acting appropriately, and insist that study is vain without timely application. 是习之. The idea is less immediately apparent in Epictetus because his school at Nicopolis seems to have had a bookish curriculum with subjects beyond what his student Arrian chose to record in the discourses. But several of Epictetus's comments about what and why we study, often with reference to the legacy of the early Stoic Chrysippus, show that he too believes there is no point in mastering the material unless one makes an effort to put it into practice. Why are you going to school? To become an expert in Chrysippus? Or to become a better person? Answer that question and you'll be on your first, you'll be well on your way. If there is a difference It is that Confucians decry self-cultivation that does not demonstrably affect the rest of the world. The very reason for learning is to help bring about the moral transformation, hua, of society that characterizes the reign of a sage king. In the passage above from Epictetus, self-cultivation is the supreme end too, but not necessarily for the sake of improving others. Still, Stoics are not all as selfish as a Confucian might rashly judge them. Another fragment from Stobaeus, once again Musonius Rufus, allegedly quoting Epictetus, recounts Lycurgus the Lacedaemonian, who reformed a youth who had blinded him in one eye. The person you gave me was violent and aggressive. I'm returning him to you civilized and refined. A Confucian would praise this Lycurgus to the skies. He's just like Shun, the future sage king, who knows that his half-brother is trying to kill him, yet gently coaxes the miscreant toward a more sociable path, as we know from Mencius 5a. One final parallel between Epictetus and Confucianism. One of Epictetus's many criticisms of Epicureanism is that it denies the natural affection for one's children. This innate or intuitive judgment is elsewhere called oikeiosis. I apologize that omega came through in a different font on this screen. That happens sometimes with PowerPoint. Anyway, oikeiosis, it's a Greek word. Literally, it means affinity. Stoics affirm its existence, but it is problematic because it potentially undermines the primacy of prohairesis. Right? What about an affinity for copulating promiscuously, overeating, taking advantage of a foolish neighbor or unsuspecting ally? Why are some natural inclinations deemed right and proper and others execrable? Much moral training is required. Julia Annis and Martha Nussbaum have both written about this very insightfully. Regardless, according to Epictetus, Epicureanism is objectionable because it requires us to act in a manner contrary to our nature. Of all the Confucians, it is Mencius who deployed such arguments most fulsomely. For example, in his arguments that failing to bury one's parents decorously is a violation of wholesome natural impulses. Now we can move on to non-Confucian texts, especially Zhuangzi. So as I said, previous scholars have observed similarities between Epictetus and Zhuangzi. I think there's a lot more. Although previous comparisons with Epictetus, as mentioned above, have focused on Zhuangzi, there are significant parallels that they have failed to observe. The first has to do with, quote, defacing the currency, unquote, a concept borrowed from cynicism that is demonstratively rejecting conventional vices and hypocrisies. In Epictetus, currency, the Greek word is nomisma, refers to the pleasures to which people have become addicted. The examples in discourses 3.3 are silver, sex, and hunting. And by which they can therefore be corrupted. Ply the proconsul with his coveted silver, and he will grant whatever you wish. Zhuangzi despises conventionalism and commercialism as well. There's no shortage of examples. One of the most memorable is Zhuangzi's loudly indecorous response to his wife's death. He sits with his legs splayed, banging on a basin and singing. Several of the so-called knack stories, sorry, I went ahead too fast, depict eccentric individuals whose authenticity lies in their readiness to flout behavioral norms, such as the draftsman who responds unrushed to his lord's summons, then retires to his quarters where he is spied squatting naked. The perceptive lord infers from this display that he is found an authentic draftsman, 真画者. Thus, Epictetus and Zhuangzi converge in their antipathy for government service. Two passages in the magnificent opening chapter in Discourses 4 refer to the perils and indignities. When one has become a favored courtier, the price is one's autonomy and equanimity. And one might even be reduced to kissing the hand of a bigwig slave in one's shameless quest for glory and honor. Quote, don't parade before me in your pride because you are a consul or a praetor. I know how you came by these offices and who presented them to you. Hey, so you have so many offices. I wonder how many shameful things you had to do in order to get all these offices. The passage immediately brings to mind one of the most mordant in Zhuangzi, where he's berated by somebody who has a whole lot of cars. And Zhuangzi says, how did you get so many cars? The last paragraph. This is how you get cars. You must have sucked a lot of the king's hemorrhoids. For this reason, Zhuangzi declares that he would rather drag his tail in the mud like a humble turtle than to be treasured in the royal hamper as a desiccated oracle bone. How best to avoid recruitment? Do not be useful. This is from Epictetus. You don't call a fighting cock that's bloodied but victorious unfortunate, but rather the one who lost without receiving a scratch. And you don't yell good dog at one that doesn't hunt or work. You do it when you see one panting, laboring, exhausted from the chase. In Zhuangzi, the same examples would have been formulated thus. The best way to avoid being bloodied in a cockfight is to be an incompetent cock. The best way to avoid exhaustion from the chase is to be an incompetent dog. Then no one will think of exploiting you for your skill. Several other passages reprise the theme of useless trees that grow unimpeded because no one abuses them for their fruit or timber. Finally, although Epictetus's relaxed Greek contrasts greatly with the lapidary style of most classical Chinese texts, there are enough commonalities on the level of expression that a few shared metaphors stand out. One of the most common is that of a doctor who offers cures based on reason and experienced diagnosis. The philosopher is the doctor of the soul, just as Mohists took it as their obligation to cure society in the same way that a doctor cures disease. Two others are more specific and more striking. Those who thoughtlessly pursue conventional values are as unfree as caged animals. This is also Discourses 4.1. Discourses 4.1 is a huge section of the whole book. Zhuangzi similarly bemoans those who allow themselves to be corralled by things, that's Zhuangzi 24, and reminds us that the pheasant fares better when it scampers along the marsh than it does in a cage, even if it is treated royally. The next one astonished me because it is such a common Chinese image. This is Epictetus. The soul is like a bowl of water, with the soul's impressions like the rays of light that strike the water. Now, if the water is disturbed, the light appears to be disturbed together with it, though, of course, it is not. There are many Chinese versions of this image. I believe the oldest one is this one from Xunzi. I think so. Differences and explanations. Final section. There are some important differences. I do not mean to suggest that one can simply pick up Epictetus and pretend that he was a Chinese philosopher like any other. Most noticeably, Chinese philosophers do not keep referring to Zeus and the gods. But this rhetorical habit is not significant because virtually all Chinese philosophers believe in heaven or the way or both, which are not very different, as we've seen above, from Epictetus's conception of theos. No Chinese philosopher ever declares that we should act in a manner contrary to the orientation of heaven or the way. Some Chinese philosophers, especially Confucians, are committed to moral governance and would have chided Epictetus for his indifference to politics. Above, we noticed more than once that even when Xunzi offers parallel observations, he manages to work in a role for government. Other Chinese philosophers are content to let others manage government and counsel the wise to lead a serene life by steering clear. That would be Zhuangzi. But few, if any, would have shared Epictetus's extreme lack of concern for other people's misfortune. Passages like the one on the screen seem quite alien. Such jarring moments are few, however. Overall, the impression of a Chinese reader would be that Epictetus is working within a similar society and comes to similar conclusions about how to live productively within it. On both sides, the intended audience consists of elite males, of the kind who own slaves. Chinese philosophers do not refer to slaves with the same regularity, but there were indeed slaves in that society too. Elite males who are likely to be studying philosophy and oratory with a view to a political career. On both sides, the master is not necessarily an author. Just as Arrian, that's Epictetus's most famous student, had to compose the discourses in Enchiridion for us to know Epictetus's philosophy, the disciples of teachers like Confucius and Mencius had to gather their memories and commit them to writing, for the masters themselves wrote nothing. And on both sides, the country is ruled by a despot, surrounded by officials who are sometimes conscientious, but just as often self-serving and sycophantic. Thus, both Epictetus and Hanfei are keenly aware that one curries favor with a tyrant, one does not love him. Why does Epictetus prove to be such a meteor comparandum for Chinese philosophy than Plato or Aristotle? After all, much of the above was true of their society too. A. Long's incisive survey, this is in the Cambridge Companion to Hellenistic Philosophy, A. Long's incisive survey of the differences between Hellenistic philosophy and that of Plato and Aristotle is helpful, because it turns out that one by one, the distinctive features of Hellenistic philosophy, especially Stoicism, swing the calculus closer to China. As the purpose of philosophy is now understood to be aiding in the conduct of a happy and productive life, the ideal that emerges is that of the wise man, Sophos, to be studied for his exemplary conduct, as opposed to the Aristotelian Phronimos. Aristotle thus resembles Mencius as a highly unusual figure in his own context, whom adoring posterity has made to seem more representative than he really was. This ideal being open to anyone, considerations of class or ethnicity start to melt away. Moreover, the urge to associate one's philosophical tradition with heroes like Socrates or Confucius led in both cultures to elaborate lineages with putative founders. The three paragons frequently named by Epictetus are Socrates, Diogenes the Cynic, and Zeno of Citium. But as we've seen in the case of Lycurgus, there are others. But here too there are many others, from the several sage kings, Sheng or Shengwang, to the less exalted but still admirable noblemen, Junzi, i.e. those whose conduct can be judged noble regardless of whether they were noble born. Other people's strengths and reforming their weaknesses has been central to Chinese philosophy for centuries and has fostered the associated conviction that we must assess people's actions fairly, including our own. I cannot explain why, of all the Hellenistic branches, it is Stoicism that provides the most fertile ground for comparison with China. But perhaps future studies will reveal similar parallels with Epicureanism, though of course not most forms of hedonism. Maybe the philosophy of Philodemus, which I don't know well enough. In any case, the evidence presented here prompts a general and falsifiable thesis. These are the courses that philosophy can be expected to follow when it is conceived as a chosen way of life. I invite others to confirm or refute this thesis by identifying a third such tradition and asking whether it displays the same characteristics. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor Goldin. We will now invite our own Professor Li Chenyang, Professor of Philosophy at TU, to give his comments.
Okay, thanks, Paul, for the presentation. I think it's eloquent, insightful.
I'm sorry. Is it just me, or are you having trouble with?
Professor Li, can you turn up the volume a little bit?
Let me see. Okay. I'm using this new thing, so. Okay, is this better?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks, Paul, for the presentation, and it is eloquent, insightful, and informative, as always. So it's a pleasure to listen to you. My comments is primarily on the methodology of your work, this work. The title of your presentation is a Chinese reading of Epictetus. That reminds me of some recent movement among scholars who study Chinese, do Chinese studies. The effort to reverse the trend of using Western theories to read Chinese. And I think you are also along the same effort. On that regard, there are still different approaches. Scholars like Li Jiankou of London School of Economics, for example, has been promoting the idea that we can find mega theories or general theories on the Chinese side to read, interpret Western philosophy, Western thinkers, instead of using Western theories to interpret Chinese philosophers. So there should be a two-way traffic rather than just one way. Her work, of course, is on mega theory. It uses large general theory to apply to read Western thinkers. In China, contemporary thinkers like Zhang Shiying, for example, has attempted to use yin-yang theory to read Western philosophy. I think that is along the same line. Your presentation, I think, is not at the mega theory level. It's on a different level. Recently, Liu Xiaogan proposed, studied different approaches to interpret Chinese philosophy. And one approach, he says, is kind of reading into, more projecting an idea to interpret Chinese philosophy. One example he uses is Mu Zongsan's use of Kant to interpret Mengzi. And another example is Roger Ames' use of process philosophy to read the Chinese thinkers. So Liu Xiaogan characterizes that approach like a reading into. You have this conception, then you read the Chinese text, you find similar things. And of course, the way Liu Xiaogan characterizes it sounds like is more kind of an injection of new idea rather than finding it in the original material. So in terms of the two levels, the mega theory level or specific issue interpretation level, it sounds like your work like is the second level. However, I would not say yours is reading into, like interjecting idea into Epictetus, but it's at that level. Now, further on that, the title makes me curious about the content, ways to characterize the content of your presentation. I'm curious why you did not label it a comparative study of Epictetus and the Chinese thinkers, rather than a Chinese reading of Epictetus. I hope you can explain a little bit to us. That is the first question on methodology. The second question actually is also common question, is also has to do with methodology. Is you are using multiple thinkers on the Chinese side to read a single thinker in Stoicism. One may say that if you do that, you pick bits from here, from there, on the one side, China side or US Western side. You can do that virtually with everyone. If you expand the net wide enough, you can find similarities across the East, West, and the China Western line with anyone. In your study, you give us examples from Zhuangzi, Kongzi, Mengzi, Xunzi, even Li Sao. So these are widely spread, and you can find those things. Of course, if one wonder whether your pick and mix making comparison is fair. And they would say if you look enough on the West side, in a variety of thinkers, you probably could say the same thing in a reversed way to any particular almost any particular Chinese thinker. You may not object to that. You may think that's okay, that's fair, as long as it's productive, we can do that. But still, there is an issue of methodology when you compare, two camps of thinking on that. Finally, a specific question. I note that you did mention dissimilarities. It's not merely similarities. I think it's a very good of you. Towards the end, you emphasize they have major differences, which I think is important to recognize. And the difference you recognize is important. I think it's true that the vast majority of thinkers, except perhaps Yang Zhu, I think I can only think of Yang Zhu, are concerned about other people's misfortune. They would not say, you don't need to care about others, just care about yourself. I think that is a major difference. Another difference I wanted to invite you to comment on is, since you are an expert on Xunzi, in Xunzi, he emphasizes the distinction between heaven and humanity, the 名与天人之分, right? He tried to say, nature just runs its own way, regardless of what you do. And it's important for us to figure out what we humans do. And that has nothing to do with heaven's will or anything like that. And if you don't make that distinction, you will have major problems. And I think most for Xunzi, perhaps they have that kind of a problem. And Xunzi stresses we need to be clear about the difference between nature and humanity. For Epictetus, if I recall correctly, he seems to emphasize the unity of the whole world, and we are part of this world. And Zeus, created the world as one thing, and it's all God's will built into it. And so his stressing point is unity rather than distinction of the two. And what do you think about that? Since that, I raised the last question because people who do Chinese philosophy usually focus on ethics and social philosophy, and not so much about metaphysics. And I think when we do Chinese philosophy, we need to pay more attention to metaphysical conceptualizations and even epistemology. And similarly, when we do comparative studies, we also should pay more attention to that aspects. So that's my comments plus questions. And again, thank you for your enlightening presentation.
Thank you. Just a few responses. You're quite right about the title. I think bad comparisons and bad theories are responsible, at least in our field, for a tremendous amount of misunderstanding. I'm not exactly arguing for doing the same wrong-headed thing in the other direction. So just as I think it's foolish to start with Western theories and then attack Chinese sources with the Western theories in hand, I'm not enthusiastic to start with Chinese theories and then attack Western sources with Chinese theories in hand. That sounds like the same sort of error, just going in the other direction. what's really going on with the title is something more concrete and personal. I know more about Chinese philosophy than I know about Greek philosophy. And when I pick up and read Epictetus, I don't read him the way most Westerners, pretty much up to the generation before mine, would have read him, as a late Stoic, a link between Greek philosophy and early Christianity. I mean, there are many ways within Western discourse that Epictetus has been read. I absolutely don't read him that way. Inevitably, when I pick up Epictetus and read him, I'm asking myself, how similar, how dissimilar is this to the Chinese sources that I know better? And the first thing that strikes me is that this is the very first time that I've picked up a Greco-Roman philosopher and thought, wow, this sounds like somebody who comes out of a similar society. Don't feel that way with Plato. I don't feel that way with Aristotle. I don't feel that way with Augustine. You talk about metaphysics, the metaphysical presumptions are so alien to Chinese ways of thinking that it's clear I'm not reading anything that could have come out of a society like that of early China. Epictetus was the first one. He's saying a lot of similar things. And so my question was, why? How does that happen? I have a colleague whose instinct is to explain such cases as, well, somebody traveled from Greece to China and brought all these ideas. There are a few reasons why I find that unlikely. So what's more plausible in my view is that I'm not a Marxist. This might sound like a Marxist idea. These philosophical similarities must reflect certain similarities on the social level. Well, what are they? And that's what I was getting to at the end. And so that brings me to your second point. I think that's a valid theoretical concern, but practically, I don't think it's a problem in this case. In other words, I'm using I'm comparing Epictetus to several different Chinese philosophers. There's a few reasons why I don't agree that in this case that's a serious objection. First of all, I don't agree that you can make any philosopher, that you can find similarities of any philosopher if you search widely enough. So, the epistles of St. Paul, I don't care how widely your search in pre-Buddhist China, you're not going to find too many similarities. Or Augustine, you're not going to find too many similarities. So I don't agree that you can compare anything. Also, I'm using Epictetus because I think he's the best Stoic. Much of what I say would be, valid of Marcus Aurelius too, would be valid of Seneca too. What I'm really getting at by comparing Epictetus to so many different Chinese sources is to distance myself from the earlier scholarship, which focused solely on Taoism. I think that's inadequate because you're really not appreciating the full extent of the striking parallels if you're just limiting your scope to Taoism, by which all they really mean is Zhuangzi. I haven't read too many comparisons of Epictetus and Lao Tzu. When they say Taoism, they're really just talking about Zhuangzi. The parallels with Confucianism are worth bringing out, and I don't think that's happened before. So I'm less concerned about who's a metaphysician, who's not a metaphysician. I'm reading them more as an intellectual historian, and basically saying, here's a phenomenon that hasn't really been explained, let alone fully appreciated yet, which is that Epictetus just feels more familiar to a Chinese reader than Plato or Aristotle. How do we explain that? And then I tried at the end. My theory is, when philosophy is conceptualized as a way of life, that's my controversial theory, you will start to get similarities like this. And I was serious at the end when I say I invite other people to test this theory. Let's find a third tradition. Okay, late imperial, Greece in the late Roman Empire, and classical China, right? They're not the only two societies where there's philosophy as a way of life. There must be a specialist who is expert in the third of them and can contest my theory. Your third point was about Epictetus and Xunzi. I would distinguish them. I would draw a different distinction between Epictetus and Xunzi. I don't think it's whether Epictetus believes that there's a unity between humans and God, and Xunzi believes there's a division, because Epictetus is constantly talking about humans who behave like fools, humans who run counter to the divine plan. So Epictetus doesn't think that everybody's all happy and holistic. The difference, I think, has to do with the obligation to form a moral government. So you talk about the distinction between heaven and human beings in Xunzi. Let's look at that famous apothegm or slogan in Xunzi: 天地生之，圣人成之. What are the 圣人成ing? They're chunging moral government. According to Xunzi, heaven didn't give us moral government. Heaven gave us the principles. Heaven gave us the Tao, the Tianxing, the Chang, the constancies. But it was the sages who made government. Human beings had to make government. Heaven didn't give us government. Epictetus is not all that interested in making government. Epictetus is on the bus, let's say, for the first half. Heaven or God or Zeus or whatever you want to use for Epictetus gave us the principles, gave us the paradigms, gave us the patterns. But I think he gets off the bus when Xunzi starts saying, good, let's use them to build society. Let's use them to build a moral government. Epictetus is like, let's leave government to others. Let's lead our own sort of life. So that forces me to compare Epictetus to different Chinese sources, because on the one hand it's similar to Zhuangzi, on the other hand it's similar to Xunzi. It's not identical to either one. The notion of recognizing, accepting, and conforming to predetermined patterns, that's shared, but then how you're going to what you're going to do with that recognition once you have it, I think that's quite divergent. So my main purpose with this paper was to open up discussion. I'm absolutely not the first person to have noticed that there are interesting parallels between Epictetus and Chinese philosophy, but I think I've identified many more than previous scholars did. And I also have a controversial thesis. I'm really curious to see whether this is going to be confirmed or rejected, that it's not because somebody traveled from China to Greece. It's not an accident either. It's because groups that think of philosophy as a way of life are going to start having these tendencies, emulating the model conduct of some other person who has thought through some of the same moral problems that you're encountering. That's very typical of Chinese philosophy, and that's one of many parallels with Epictetus. Anyway, I see that there's already a question in the chat, so maybe I'll wind up there.
Well, thank you, Professor Goldin. Thank you, Professor Li. So now we're in the Q&A session. Those of you who are interested to ask a question, you can either send a note in the chat, or you can talk directly. If you want to open up your camera, that would be fine too as well. And I would encourage all the students to ask questions, especially whether it's undergrad or graduate students. Please don't be shy. So Professor Goldin, you saw that comment already. Do you want to respond to that comment first?
Yeah, my sense is that everybody I mentioned, and of course, I'm talking about texts, not people. We don't know what Epictetus believed. All we know is what Arian wrote. We don't know what Confucius believed. All we know is what the disciples wrote. We don't know what Zhuangzi believed. All we know is what the text bearing Zhuangzi's name says. But all of these sources that I discussed are much less interested than in truth than in the thoughtful and fruitful application of it. So there are several, so early Stoicism had a lot of logic hacking, and Chrysippus, some of the passages that I mentioned are good examples of that. And it seems clear that Epictetus was teaching them at his school, but he also emphasizes over and over again that you're not going to do well in my school if you just master the logical treatises that I'm teaching. The reason why you learn them is because they're tools which you then have to apply creatively, thoughtfully, appropriately, as the situation warrants. So you're not going to become a great philosopher, according to Epictetus, just by mastering logical methods. You have to be a discerning person with a lot of what my old teacher Dueming called moral reasoning. You have to recognize, when your learning is going to come into play in a situation that you encounter in the course of your life. That just strikes me as very similar to the outlook of virtually every classical Confucian, but the example I gave was the first line of the Analects, 学, okay, that's good, but 识习之, that's much harder, right? Anybody can 学, but 识习之, first of all, you have to practice it. That's already much harder. And then the hardest word of all is 识. How do you decide when it's the right time? You have to use your judgment. You have to, right? You don't learn that exactly. You get the tools, but then the really admired skill is applying those schools. So my general response to the question is that all of them, and this is another interesting parallel, are less interested in truth than in the thoughtful, creative, timely, and appropriate application of truth in real life circumstances.
Okay. So others, please. Oh yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Goldin, for your talk. So I have one question. One line of traditional historiography on history of Greek philosophy holds the view that this Hellenistic turn toward the inward, the emphasis placed on a care for the self, and also the point that you mentioned, a kind of aversion to serving kings and doing public service, can be explained by the decline of the fall of the polis system, the rise of imperial forms of governance and government, and also the shrinking of the public space. I'm not, of course, debating the validity of that claim, but I just want to ask you, do you see any parallels in the Chinese case, or do you think the political and intellectual development in China is quite different than in the Hellenistic context?
On a very general level, there are obviously some similarities, which is that an old society is yielding to a new society. The new society is characterized by immense empire, right? If you're living in the year one, there's, I think, something like 40% chance that you'll be born in China or Rome, which is amazing. That never happened again before or since, that there's a 40% chance that you would have been born in one of two empires in the world. The population of Han China and Rome, again, around the time of Augustus, was 50 to 55 million in both cases. So there are some general similarities. An old society. In the case of China, I don't think it's a city-state political system, but it is an old political system that's either in the process of crumbling and everybody's aware of it, or has crumbled if you're talking about Han philosophy. And for Epictetus, all right, that's quite similar too. So whatever Greece was is over, but then also whatever Rome was is surely changing over the course of his lifetime. And he saw that he got a front row seat because he largely through his immense talent, also through luck, he became known to emperors, senators, elites, and the elite young men would hop on a boat in order to take classes with him. He's a little bit like Xunzi in that respect. Lisa studies with Xunzi. Why? Not because he loves Xunzi, but because he wants to be able to say, I studied with Xunzi. And a lot of elite young men in Rome take a boat to Nicopolis for the same reason. They want to say, I was at Epictetus's school. So on the level of details, I don't necessarily agree with that argument, and I feel that you don't totally agree with it either. The polis system and this political system of the warring states China is not identical, but there are certainly larger similarities, which is manifestly an older decentralized political system is giving way to a very different one, and in both cases, it's an immense empire and an unprecedented empire. So there were Greek empires. There was Alexander, although that didn't last very long. But there was nothing like the Roman Empire before let's say Augustus.
Okay.
Should I move on? Do you think it would be helpful to attempt to find parallels or contrasts in how these early figures were appropriated by later writers? For example, Epictetus by Montaigne or Mengzi by Litre. That's fascinating. That's a great idea. It would be a very big project. You're quite right that Western philosophers continually came back to Epictetus and kept reading him differently. I mean, one of the big debates until recently, it's not the way people read Epictetus anymore. But for much of the past millennium, a big debate over Epictetus is he a proto-Christian? Is he not a proto-Christian? And the answer to that is he's not a proto-Christian, but he lives in the same soup that early Christianity comes out of. So if you're finding similarities with someone like Tertullian, it's not because they came from the same distant planet. It's because they emerged out of very similar society. So just the reception of Epictetus is extremely complex, and the reception of Mengzi in China, of course, is extremely complex. So that's a great idea. I don't know whether I'm capable of doing it, but I love the project, and I'd also be curious to see what would come out of that.
Let me just interject with a quick announcement. Our organizer has said that if that it's the tradition of this talk to take a picture of everybody afterwards. So those of you who want to have your picture taken, you can just stay on and then turn on your camera later. Okay, so just a quick announcement. All right, any other questions? Any other questions from our students?
Sorry for the interruption. So could we just stop for a while then to just take a group picture first? Then if the guest want to open up your camera, it's time. Thank you very much.
Do I need to do anything, or do I just stay where I am?
Do we just count the 1, 2, 3?
Okay.
Okay, it's not mandatory, so yeah.
Okay, about 1, 2, 3. Okay, another slide. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
All right. So questions, comments, especially from our philosophy colleagues, any sort of questions and comments?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
Okay, thanks, Professor Goldin. Yeah, we actually understand that the Epictetus book was among the first of the Western classic translated and introduced to the China by Li Mado, the Matthew Rich, and Michel Foucault also constantly referred to the Epictetus doctrine. Yeah, so I'm actually just curious whether did they also notice the similarity between the Epictetus and the those Chinese philosophers you mentioned? Yeah, if yes, does it influence their reading of Chinese philosophy? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. I don't know of any explicit example of that in Ricci. So it's a very plausible theory. So Ricci thinks of Epictetus as, not an early Christian, but an early philosopher who is exemplary of the kind of philosophical world that early Christianity comes out of. And so Ricci's conception of Christianity, as we well know, is such that it's open to the idea that philosophies from other parts of the world could be fundamentally congruent with it. That's what that kind of accommodationism made Ricci famous. So it's a plausible conjecture that Ricci would have found he was mostly interested in early Confucianism. He thought everything else was just corruption. But early Confucianism he accepted was congruent with the Christian principles that he was trying to teach. So as I'm saying, it's a plausible conjecture that Ricci would have found some congruences between Epictetus and classical Confucianism. The issue is that I'm not aware of any explicit moment in Ricci, but I also haven't checked. So that would be an interesting thing to look for. What does Ricci have to say about Epictetus in his writings for either Chinese or Western audiences? And there may well be something there. In the case of Foucault, that seems a little bit less promising. I admire Foucault and so on and so forth. I do not get much of a sense that Foucault understood anything about Chinese philosophy. And so that the Care of the Self, Volume 3 of his trilogy on the philosophy of sex, which was deeply influenced by Pierre Hadot, that somebody else was alluding to. That's all absolutely right, and Foucault is, interested in Epictetus for those reasons. But if Foucault demonstrated any good understanding of Chinese philosophy, I haven't found it yet, and I would invite others to point that out to me. I just got a private. Oh no, okay, it's not a private question. It's from Kathleen Wright. So. A question about the reading of Epictetus is indifferent to the misfortunes of others, given the examples of the death of a child or wife compared to Zhuangzi's actions are related to the death of his wife. Shall we ask Professor Wright to elaborate?
Yes, please. Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just wondered, when I read Epictetus and he talks about the death of a child or of a wife, I read it differently than, for example, Zhuangzi talking about the death of his wife, both of them very old. And it strikes me that what's going on in Epictetus is more the death of a child as in infant mortality and the death of a wife as in childbirth. And for Epictetus, that would be something that you wouldn't have any control over. So that you could be indifferent to this misfortune, because this is a misfortune that it is in no way under your control to have any effect upon. So instead of just reading wife and child, I'm reading it as, you know, young wife, young child, and the premature death of either the child or of the wife. I wonder if that gives a different reading. So it isn't so much whether this would dull a little bit the difference between that Li Chengyang said between Chinese are always concerned about the misfortunes of others versus Epictetus. So I'm wondering whether, Paul, you would accept the interpretation, the reading of Epictetus, that the death there of child or death of wife has to do with something when both are young, child and wife, a different setting than the death of an older wife, as in Zhuangzi.
It's an interesting observation, because in Zhuangzi, in Zhile, it's clear that the wife is not young.
Right.
She's born children. That's why Huizi is so shocked. They've grown old together, and he's just banging on his bass and singing. There are a couple of other subtle differences that I didn't get into.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do think there is the fundamental congruity that in both cases there is a recognition that there's nothing you can do about it. But there's a little bit of a difference. In Epictetus, I find it really very self-centered. It's just going to cause you grief. Nothing productive is going to come out of it. So why waste all that energy? And Zhuangzi, it's a little different because, first of all, there's the recognition that Zhuangzi's death is inevitably, right, it's inseparable from her life, so he's not so sad about it anymore, not because he's accepting it, but because, how shall I put this exactly? He loved her while she was alive, and there was no way for her to be alive without eventually dying. So there was no way he could have loved her at all if she didn't die. And secondly, he imagines her.
Right.
She's sleeping restfully in a he doesn't know, but and maybe she's sleeping restfully in a room or something. So it's not totally self-centered. He's also wondering, well, is this bad for her? Maybe not. Maybe she's sleeping peacefully now. So that there are some subtle differences between what Epictetus says about the loss of a wife and what Zhuangzi, again, as they're both represented. I'm not maintaining that Epictetus or Zhuangzi wrote either examples. And I like your observation that clearly Zhuangzi is not talking about a young wife. He's talking about a wife that he spent his whole life with. So she didn't die young. She didn't die in childbirth. It wasn't a case like that. I think that's a very good observation.
We have a question from Samuel. You raised your hand, please.
Yeah, hi. I asked the same question about Montaigne just now. So I have a different question. So there's Ivanhoe's book on Confucian moral self-cultivation. And in there, he talks about how there are different thinkers who have different models of cultivation. So Mengzi has the developmental model, Xunzi has the reformation model, and Jushi has a recovery model, and so on. Do you see Epictetus as fitting into any of these particular models, which Ivanhoe...
Not really. Do you? I mean, all these models, I think, are useful to the extent that they're useful, and then when they're not useful, they're a little bit like Zhuangzi with the fish trap. Once you catch the fish, you don't need the model anymore. I don't really fetishize theories. I don't fetishize models. I use them as tools, and if they're helpful, that's great. If they're not, then so what? Do you think Epictetus fits? I mean this as an honest question. Do you think Epictetus fits any one of those three models? I don't think it's a development. I don't think it's a Mencian model. So the one of the three that I would probably cancel would be that one.
If I had to pick one of the three, I'd say he's probably closest to a kind of reformation model with the focus on habits and training yourself, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, that's plausible. What's as I said, what really opened my eyes to the similarities were the ideas of sort of like communing with yourself. Self, I'm being presented with a temptation, but wait, do I really need to succumb? No, I don't have to. In other words, explicitly laying out the inner dialogue that Epictetus does this all the time. That resounds to me with a philosopher like Xunzi. So I don't know which of Ivanhoe's three models that corresponds to. And as I said, the one I would give up first is the Mencian one. But, and I'd also be willing to give up all three. But where I felt I was reading sort of a kindred thinker who was approaching problems with a lot of the same metaphors and a lot of the same ways of thinking is when Epictetus has these explicit dialogues with his prohieresis. That's, of all the classical Chinese thinkers, to me, that comes closest to Xunzi. Do you really need to do this? No, you don't. Let's think this through. Which Chinese philosopher does that sound like? Well, to me, that sounds like Xunzi. Neo-Confucians do this too, of course. So it's not exclusively Xunzi.
Thank you. Other questions, please? Comments, questions? Well, let me ask a question then. You mentioned that, Professor Goldin, about the sort of the similarity between the two societies. So perhaps we can go a little bit deeper, right? Dig deeper in terms of do a more sort of contextual historical analysis of Hellenistic society vis-a-vis sort of ancient China. So anything sort of on your end you think that we can do there, so sort of talking about societal structures and all the other sort of political changes that happen during these periods?
Yeah, there are a lot of people who are already doing that, and they're historians, generally speaking, they're historians rather than philosophers. So Griet van Kerbergen, Michael Nyland, a Danish scholar named Fiebiger Bang, I forget his first name, then Walter Scheidel, who's I think originally Austrian, publishes in both German and in English. They have been, they've sort of taken up the challenge of saying, all right, we've done a lot of classical China versus classical Greece, and the results have been mixed. Let's look at the Roman Empire and the Han Empire. Let's look at other moments of comparison, and a lot of the work has been pretty productive. Similarities and differences in things like fiscal regime. So I think in this area, philosophers are a little bit behind. If philosophers are interested in questions like this, they have some catching up to do, because historians over the last 15 to 20 years, there have been comparisons, for example, between the Eastern Han Dynasty and the late Roman Empire. What's the similarity? The proliferation of private estates and how that affects the structure of society, how the political control from the center on the periphery, if the periphery is organized into manorial estates, right? They get in the way. So there's been a lot of good work in those areas, and I think philosophers need to catch up, or they can say they're just not interested, which is fine. I don't I don't criticize that, but I have to say, after so many decades, enough with the Aristotle. It's not yielding great results. If we're going to do this, let's look at some other philosophers instead.
We have another question in the comments.
If philosophy is a way of life, what is the social function of the professional philosopher? I think, a Chinese text like Mengzi or Mozi has a more explicit answer to that question. Teach other people and produce a more harmonious society. That's clear in both Mozi and Mengzi. The content of the teaching, as Bill Gates would say, is not the same, but the conception of the social function is very similar. The rest of the world is self-defeating in its ignorance. Our purpose is to enlighten them and produce a better society. As I was saying before, I don't think Epictetus's goal is so pretentious. I don't think he's trying to create a new society, but he is trying to help bring comfort to people by helping them analyze what is bringing them grief, and thereby to help them overcome it. So he's as much of a therapist as he is a philosopher. Martha Nussbaum has talked about this too, because of his conviction that philosophy is the best therapy.
All right. Any other comments, questions? No. Students, colleagues, question, comments? Okay.
I will say that Stoicism is exhausting. I can see why people are tired.
Oh, whether there's one,
you don't get a moment of you have to be disciplined constantly, vigilant ever. You don't get a moment to just sort of eat an ice cream and watch baseball.
Okay, there's another one.
Okay. Yeah. That's a I don't remember who asked the question, but the one who's talking about the care of the self was clearly alluding to both Hadot, it's H-A-D-O, it's Hadot, was clearly alluding to both Pierre Hadot and Michel Foucault, who I believe were colleagues. I'm like 90% sure of that.
So any comments on Hadot or? Hello? Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay.
Oh, someone just raised a hand.
Oh, okay.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Hello, Professor Goldin. Thank you for your brilliant speech. I have noticed that you cited samples in Li Sao, Xunzi, and Epictetus to show a distinction between the body and heart. Could we say this is their similarity in making distinction between body and heart? And could we see that the body belongs to like the emperor and the heart belongs to the individual? Could we see that show some similarities? I'm not sure whether my comparison is right. Thank you.
Depending on how you formulate that, I either agree a lot or halfway. I certainly think this is an important point that gets lost when Epictetus is compared to Zhuangzi and Zhuangzi only. A major theme in Epictetus is that you have resources, you have faculties that help you overcome temptation, deal with grief, and so on. It's not just that you don't have control over it, but the deity gave you faculties to help you. Let's start using them. And that's why Epictetus talks so much about prohairesis and so much about the mental life and this inner dialogue that I was talking about. That's just about the only weapon you have. You're not the strongest person. You're not the richest person. You can't control your social success or failure, certainly not perfectly. You can't control your health. You can't control your fame. You can't control your popularity. The one thing you have is that gift, which he believes you got from the deity, and he also believes that most people don't use it. They don't recognize it. And it's a discipline. That's why I say it's exhausting to be a Stoic. It's a discipline. You have to exert it, and the best way to exert it is to train at it in the same way that a wrestler trains at training. That does strike me as pretty similar to ideas in philosophers like Xunzi, but also Mengzi, that you're not just a prisoner of your emotions. You're not an unthinking animal who has to do, whatever instinct drives that animal. You have a heart, and this is a point that Mencius and Xunzi do have in common, and animals don't. And because of that heart, you have the capacity to think about how you're going to respond to moral situations, to emotions, sorrow, grief, pleasure. And then both of them immediately say, well, if you have the capacity, you also have an obligation. Because if you don't do it, then you're not living up to, then you're not doing your best. And they also believe that comes from heaven. That's just as clear in Mengzi as it is in Epictetus, and I think it's pretty clear in Xunzi too. So if you formulate it like that, then I agree with you. That's not only an important similarity, it's a similarity that you just don't get if the extent of your comparison, this is getting back to Li Chenyang's criticism, the extent of your comparison is just with Zhuangzi. You don't get this very important point that these philosophers have these sort of raging debates within themselves. And to me, that's interesting for a bunch of reasons. One of which is that, again, until recently, there was this myth that there's no mind-body contrast in Chinese philosophy. I think that's simply baloney. But even if we take it seriously, which I no longer do, then how do you explain this? Then how do you explain this inner debate that's clearly happening in Mengzi and Xunzi? So if you formulate it that way, yes, I think that's a very important similarity, and you don't necessarily find that in every philosopher. On the one hand, I'm not claiming that Epictetus is the only Western philosopher who has this. I'm not claiming that Mencius and Xunzi are the only Chinese philosophers who have that. But it's not universal. It's not in I don't know. I don't think it's in Lao Tzu.
Thank you.
Okay, another one in the comments.
Oh, okay, let me open the chat box. I'm sorry. Ethics and social philosophy aren't really unrelated to metaphysics and epistemology. I agree with that. Professor Li Chenyang means focus or foci, but do you think that ethics can be separated from metaphysics and epistemology? I think these are extremely Western distinctions. So I'm wary of saying yes or no, because metaphysics, well, why is it even called metaphysics? It's called metaphysics because Aristotle taught it after physics, so it's called metaphysics. I always start to cringe a little bit when we start with categories instead of starting with the material. I certainly agree that you have to be self-conscious about what sorts of methodological conceptions you bring to a text. I don't believe in naive reading, but I'm sort of wary of distinguishing between ethics and metaphysics and all of these Western concepts. I mean, I feel like I want to say yes. I feel like I want to say they're not unrelated. If you were to wake up Xunzi and explain ethics and social philosophy and metaphysics and epistemology, and ask him, well, don't you think they're related? I feel like he would want to say yes. All right, what's the basis of the ethics and social philosophy that he recommends? There's certain metaphysical claims about the nature of the universe. If it weren't for, and also the nature of human beings, right? If it weren't for those constancies that he regards as given, he wouldn't have the ethics and social philosophy that he does. So I feel like I want to say yes to this question, but it's also part of the reason why I'm not in a philosophy department. I don't start with these ologies because I'm dealing with a very different tradition.
All right. Other questions, comments?
Another response, a little bit attenuated, but it is a response to the a point that is that, correct me if I'm mispronouncing the name, is that Villaver?
Hello,
I've
Paul.
certainly
Hello, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. And I've certainly seen your name in print, but I don't know how to pronounce it.
Well, my name, we pronounce it here as Rani Villaver.
Rani Villaver.
Yes.
So another quick response to the point that you're raising. My current book project is on aesthetics. And the main reason is that there's a lot of fascinating Chinese material. But one of the impetus was when people say they do Chinese philosophy, they tend to mean ethics or political philosophy. And they tend to give aesthetics short shrift for reasons that are not really very good. They're not cogent. So I quite agree if you're saying that that these different fields of philosophy can't be regarded as disconnected if we're talking about most Chinese philosophers. That these are distinctions that they didn't come up with.
Okay. Well, others, comments, questions? One? Well, if we don't have any more comments and questions, then I guess that's end of this talk. So one last call. Any more questions, comments? No? Okay then, so please join me to thank Professor Goldin for this fascinating talk and that he spent so much time answering our questions. Okay, thank you, Professor.
Thank you everyone for tuning in.
Okay, all right, let's conclude this talk. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye,
Thank
Paul.
you. Thank you, Chen Yang, for your comments.
You're welcome. See you somewhere at the conference or somewhere. Bye-bye.
I hope so.
Okay, thank you for your talk. Bye.
Thank you, Prof. Lee, for your comments.
Thank you,
Thank you, Chuan Yuan,
answering them.
for sharing.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, Prof. Goldin. Very good night.
Same
right.
to you. Thank you. Well, good morning.
Yeah, it's getting late at your end. So
good brunch time.
Okay.
Yeah, 11:16 your time, right? So PM.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Have a wonderful night then.